What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you my review after 100% for Wartales, a game that sees us running around an open world sandbox style leading a group of mercenaries as they struggle to survive their bleak surroundings. However, before we dive into all that, I do have to mention a variety of things. For starters, I review games after 100% all the time to set me apart from other reviewers on the platform, and while that does include the achievements, it also includes a lot more than that. Linked below is a video describing everything that I cover. If you're not subscribed and go to my channel page, you'll also find that video there. And my Steam profile is public and linked below as well. In addition to that, however, previously I had done a sponsored video for this title and its developer, Shiro Games, which is where I got the copy for this particular title. I've had it in my hands for roughly 2 weeks. And I played the game for a significant amount of time before it even launched, in addition to playing it previously before that in its early access version, which is how I'm getting this review out so quickly. However, while a review would obviously never be sponsored, it's important that you know that I did do a sponsored video for this game previously. However, with all of that out of the way, we can actually dive into this one and talk about it a little further. As I already mentioned, this game sees us controlling a band of mercenaries and moving them throughout the land, which has since been overrun with banditry, thievery, and is generally a pretty rough place these days following the collapse of an empire in the face of a plague, which is a nice place to start the story section of this video, or more specifically, I should say story scenarios. Throughout the entire game of Wartales, when we are on the sort of overland map, we'll be traveling between 6 distinct regions. Each region has its own story. You can do these sort of independently of each other. These scenarios functionally act as what you might consider a main quest of sorts. They all do relate to each other a little bit, even if they are independent stories. However, due to the nature of how you can approach them, this isn't really the type of game that has a proper ending. You kind of just finish doing everything there is possible to do, or you move on to a different playthrough with a different group of mercenaries in a different part of the world. So story-wise, the game is pretty much over when you decide you're done, and much of the gameplay and the rest of the stories kind of revolve around the emergent story around your mercenaries and their relationships with each other, as well as the various contracts you'll be taking on across the land itself. So the game does lack a sort of distinct narrative, though each region does have a story to tell you, which will usually see you picking a side depending on how you play those quests out, but understand the story here is more about your journey with your mercenaries than any particular narrative. However, in the world building section, we'll go over a little more about all of the things they do to make a unique and interesting world for you to move through, even if you aren't the big hero. First up, though, we are going to talk game options when you actually go to fire up the game. The game has a variety of ways you can customize your individual playthrough, and the first thing you'll do is pick your destiny, which is a set of sort of starting buffs for your party. Most of these are relatively minor and can be easily overcome in terms of negatives that they'll grant you. However, at the start of this, you'll pick what kind of party you want, kind of what their background is, which will set your starting mercenaries to a particular class. Though for the most part, I'd say pick what feels fun here, though it is dictating what your start is going to look like. After that, you'll pick region locked or adaptive exploration. This is a very big choice because you are deciding how the game is going to scale. On your first playthrough, you're forced to start in an area called Tiltron. However, as you play the game and unlock and explore other areas, you'll pick up other starting points for future playthroughs. And because of this, the game will scale to you in both modes. However, how it scales is determined by this choice. Adaptive will make sure the game is always a challenge, no matter what you do. Whereas region locked will see areas scale up to a limit, so to speak, also based on where you start a little bit and when you go to which areas. However, in region locked, there will come a point where you sort of just over level an area and it will become pretty much a breeze to move through because there's an upper limit to what those things can do. This means that for every area, while it might be initially challenging, you will absolutely hit a break point where you're just past the challenge that that area has to offer. So for most people, I would say region locked is probably the way you want to go. But if you're looking for an ever-present challenge, adaptive can be fun. From there, though, we have other options in terms of difficulty and game settings. For starters, the actual combat difficulty, which is sort of easy, normal, hard as usual. And most of what this affects is the level and number of enemies in comparison to you. Though I would say for each of them, there does does come a sort of break point where you've got your troop and everything moving to a point where the difficulty isn't so bad, though the higher difficulty can provide a very challenging start of the game. But all of these difficulties kind of just adjust the point at which the game is going to get relatively easy as you get more resources and everything under your belt, which is the case for many games. In addition to this, though, we can pick a few other difficulty options which relate to how some of the survival options work in addition to the save mode. So the survival difficulty really just dictates how many resources you're going to need, as well as the price of various things. On expert, money and resources are going to be tighter, which can make things more difficult. Though I would say for survival difficulty, much of what you're picking here is how difficult do you want it to be to move around the map. And then lastly, we have our save mode. Iron Man is pretty straightforward. If your troop goes down and you lose everybody, that's it, game over. Free is pretty much what you would expect. You can save mostly whenever you want outside of combat in as many save files as you want, whereas limited limits your save to one save file. You can save very often, but you've just got the one file to use, so you can kind of pick whatever floats your boat there. And then before we actually dive into the world, you'll be able to pick the appearance options as well as some of the traits for your starting team. Pretty much every recruit you get is going to have traits that adjust various things about them, some positive, some negative, and if you pick too many traits at the beginning here, it will force you to take some negatives as well. Negatives usually affect resource generation or how much you have to spend to upkeep that particular person, but their actual class was affected by your destiny choice earlier. Afterwards, we are dropped into the world, which is a good place to start talking about the various progression systems before we get into the world and gameplay systems. Now, this is a pretty dense game. What this game lacks in story, it makes up for various systems, little details, and things that just kind of blend the whole package together that make this game really fun to engage with. While you'll start with 4 characters, it's not unheard of towards the end of the game to have potentially a group of 20 plus individuals. Characters can very much so die on any difficulty. In combat, if they get brought to 0 health, they'll enter a dying status, and if they take damage again, even from status effects, they will be permanently dead, unless of course you reload. You can gain recruits for your mercenary group by a variety of means, the most common of which would be to go to the tavern and simply recruit them, which will usually cost influence, which is how well known your troop is, in addition to a little bit of gold. You can also go to various jails around the world and recruit prisoners, or even capture animals or people in the midst of combat, which will usually cost you something like rope or chains. Once you've brought that character under half health, that will pop up and be an option. This includes a lot of animals, which means you can get things like bears on your team. You can also go to various stables and purchase horses, all of which can participate in combat under certain situations. To control animals under your belt, though, you have to have a companion with the Beastmaster trait, otherwise the animals will just do whatever they want. As you grow and manage your troop, they will be leveling up and gaining experience as you participate in combat and complete quests. Leveling up sees you dealing with a variety of skills and specializations. Depending on the character that you have selected, they'll have a variety of specializations available to them based on their class, with animals kind of having their own unique thing going on to provide you a couple of options. However, each class does have some hidden specializations which you can unlock typically by completing arenas and then finding a quest giver to teach you, so even the starting allocation here isn't everything. As you level up, when you hit certain level milestones, the max level being 12 by the way, that character will be able to pick various abilities that are going to give them some boost or define the equipment they're allowed to use based on their specialization or class. In addition, when they level up, they get aptitude points, which allows you to increase their stats. Typically by 1 or 2, this is somewhat random. However, you can get an ability later called career plans, which will let you spend influence to directly decide what you want the level up to be. Though even just normally, you will have a couple of options to pick from, but obviously you want to go with the upgrade that gives you 2 as opposed to 1. Stats on characters are important. For the most part, they do what you would think. Willpower, you want to probably get to 15 if possible, because this will keep a recruit or unit from dying once per combat, which is is pretty useful. Movement, strength, dex, all of that is pretty straightforward. Various skills will scale off of specific stats, which will tell you what they are, and is relatively easy to manage. But then we have our items and crafting systems, alongside professions. So while you will certainly gain items from defeating enemies as well as buying them from either traveling merchants or in various villages, you'll be able to upgrade your gear and your weapons, which are typically class and specialization locked per character, as well as having item level requirements. The higher the item level, the better it is, with each level being a pretty substantial boost in damage. However, your best bet for equipment is usually crafting, because where the drops from enemies and merchants even can be a bit random, you can craft very specific things you would like to use, which is where professions come in. There are several of them, something like 9 or 10 I think I counted, and these will allow you to do things like craft various upgrades for your camp via the tinkerer, or use the blacksmith to create actual equipment, use a cook to help with the food cost for your troop. You can get an angler to fish for you and find food that way, or potentially find other secrets, or get someone who can be a miner to break things open for you or gather ore, etc., etc. However, blacksmithing and tinkering I would say are the most important because they're going to give you direct upgrades. Crafting is going to see you outfitting your gear with better and better stuff, as well as providing said gear with sockets for armor layers. Late in the game, you can start crafting armor layers, which are just straight upgrades to armor that you can slot into little spots like jewels, which will upgrade your equipment and provides a sort of late game progression, so to speak. But I mentioned a bunch of camp systems, so what does that look like? Well, when you're out in the open world, you will be getting tired as you move through, and eventually you're going to need to rest for the day, which you will do at your camp, which is highly customizable. While it starts out very bare bones with basically just a fire, using a tinkerer in particular and the workshop, you can start crafting various upgrades to your camp, such as a big tent, a cooking pot, a hitching post for your animals, a strategy table for your leader even. And honestly, if we covered every single one, we would be here all day, as the camp system is extensive. You can move your units around the camp, and that's probably the most important thing to know. Most individual upgrades to your camp will get bonuses if you have companions assigned to them, which you can do by moving those companions over to that particular piece of equipment, which will help you out. Things like the cooking pot require certain professions. For instance, if you have a cook assigned to the cooking pot, this will reduce the food costs for your troop, and most of these bits of equipment can be upgraded further if you spend your knowledge on them, which is the other big progression system to know: knowledge and paths. Much of the progression that isn't character specific here is handled via the knowledge system. As you explore and craft various things for the first time, you'll gain knowledge points as well as potentially unlock further upgrades. You can spend the knowledge points you earn on exactly that, knowledge for the various professions or general sort of passive upgrades for your troop as a whole. And this is how you're going to learn how to do things like craft new stuff as well as upgrade various traits. Now, the troop-wide ones you'll eventually probably get all of. However, the profession-specific ones typically require you to engage with that profession in some way to fully unlock everything, and then it's also possible to get recipes that unlock these for you as well, as not everything will be unlocked simply by crafting something or just having the knowledge points. Sometimes you have to have the knowledge points and interact with that in some way so you learn about the thing you're trying to unlock, which is how things like the blacksmithing profession work. In order to unlock the higher tiers of equipment, you need to have a blacksmith that is at an appropriate level, as the professions earn experience as well, and then you have to craft the associated thing, which will then teach you how to do it better and potentially unlock the next tier of that thing for you. In addition to knowledge, we have the paths system, and it works in mostly the same way. This will see you performing other more varied actions, either specific things in combat or doing untoward things like stealing or attacking innocent people, or handling various commerce bits, etc., etc. But each time you do these things a certain number of times, you'll earn various path points, and when you earn enough of these, you'll level that path up, which will give you a point that you can then spend on a various upgrade to that specific style of play, which can be pretty varied. All of these max out at 9 though, and overall it's a pretty fun system. Last, on the progression side of the systems, I want to mention companion relationships. I was talking all about the camp a little bit earlier, and where you position companions in that camp is actually important, as oftentimes, based on events in game, say things that happened in combat, will result in little moments for your companions where you have to pick an option to decide how they deal with a certain situation. Sometimes those situations will refer to close companions. This literally means the companions they are close to in camp. And because of this can dictate their relationship with the various companions around them, which can lead to them either falling in love potentially or hating each other, all of which can affect their happiness. Though happiness is more of the world and gameplay section, which we are now officially going to talk about. What this game lacks in a full narrative, it makes up for in its world building. The game sees us traveling a land roughly 100 years after a massive plague swept through and caused the entire thing to collapse. Luckily, that plague was cured later. However, it's still a problem that is present now. The plague effectively turns people into zombies, and they have to either eat meat or be driven insane. When they go insane, they are no longer savable. However, if they can get a cure before that happens, they'll be okay. However, the distribution of this cure is not perfect by any means, and naturally, this means the plague is still very much an issue in some places, though not as much of a guaranteed death sentence as it used to be. Nonetheless, though, after the Empire collapsed, the world has devolved into banditry, thievery, with most people just trying to do the best they can in the face of challenging times, which has led to the rise of a lot of mercenary companies popping up to handle exactly the problems that are present with this type of living, which is where we come in. We'll be traveling the world, picking sides potentially between various regional powers to solve the story scenarios, as well as just taking on contracts and quests. And you get to decide much of the morality of that. You can very much so attack merchants on the road, steal things from people, which might get the guard sent after you. Many of the story scenarios also allow you to actually pick a side between two fighting groups, or honestly swap back and forth between a few of them sometimes, and a lot of that's pretty fun. Now, broadly speaking, I think it's important to understand that while most of this game is sort of gritty, relatively human back and forth, it is important to remember that this game is actually what I would consider low fantasy. There are very much so things like ghosts. The plague victims effectively turn into zombies, and while I don't want to spoil it, later in the game you can even meet some slightly more fantastical creatures than that. But then we have the more nitty-gritty, how are we actually traveling this world? Well, as I'm sure you've seen on screen up to this point, we do that by leading our troop across the large open map before making our way to individual points of interest that we can actually enter. When we enter these areas, this is generally done as like a small building or place you can view, which will allow you to interact with various things there, talk to NPCs, etc., etc. However, as you travel, your characters will slowly get fatigued, and when that's empty, they're eventually going to need to rest. When characters rest, you need to feed them and potentially pay them. Every 3 rests, you have to pay your mercenaries. If you don't pay them, they're going to get unhappy, and if your happiness falls low enough, they will eventually just leave. Same thing goes with food. Everybody needs to eat, which means what you manage to be able to do in the world is largely dictated by your money, your food, and your ability to rest. There are various perks and things that will affect all of this stuff, of course, and how many mouths you have to feed dictates how much food you need, etc., etc. So much of the gameplay loop is typically running around the wild, doing things like contracts, taking care of quests, gathering up resources from the world, before heading back to town, selling it, getting rested up, getting more supplies, picking up more contracts, going back out, etc. That's kind of the standard game loop per region, and while that's pretty fun for the most part, as one bit of criticism, I would say that sometimes it can be difficult to sort of push past an area into new things, because it's like, I would like to go do this story scenario, but first I have to go back to town, I have to feed everyone, I also don't have enough money, so I have to go do some contracts, and once I get all of that done, I can finally get back to what I was doing. And little moments like that can be a little frustrating, but that is kind of just part of the game, I suppose, so something to keep in mind. In addition to all of that, though, there are various activities you can get up to around the world map that I think are really cool, such as the arenas, the hunts, special bosses you can find, or exploring ancient tombs. Arenas will see you fighting with a small group of 4 individuals through a variety of combat encounters one after the other, with you only getting to either fix your armor or rest up in between matches, with them having rules and things that will change as you progress through the arena. There's a variety of arenas with different rules, so that can be kind of fun to mess around with. There are trackers out in the world, which will send you on hunts after ghost animals, and completing these will give you access to the various armor layers that I mentioned earlier. And trackers trade in fangs, so they can also give you a bunch of leather and resources that are part of some of the later game materials that you need for crafting. You can also find special, very difficult boss fights out in the world that are fun. Each area has one in particular. And then there are things like the ancient tombs. Exploring a tomb is much different than the rest of the world's exploration because you actually have to move from room to room inside of a tomb, which will cost you torches. You also have to fight enemies in the dark sometimes, which can be rough, all while trying to solve a puzzle to get at a resting place of someone who is revered in some way, which will usually give you a special reward of some sort. And I really enjoyed those just because of how different they are from the rest of the game. Some of them play into, I would say, the broader world narrative, so I don't want to say too much though. All in all, I would say this game has fantastic world building, though it does make for a world that is a little bit depressing. Like, even when good things happen, it's still kind of bad. However, they do manage to give you a variety of biomes to explore: swamps, snowy mountains, fields, wine country. There's even a city you can actually explore, which I thought was really cool. The province with the city is probably my favorite region, as like half of that area is the city, and you kind of move through it like you do the rest of the world, which I thought was kind of a novel idea. And there's just a lot of little touches that I think really sell the gameplay of the world. Like, there are trade goods that are worth one thing here and a different price other places, so you can travel and do that. In order to get from region to region, you either have to get a border pass from completing the scenario where you are, or pay gold. And I would say probably the best part about this game is the world as a result, because it feels like the world will continue independent of you. You are just a mercenary, involving yourself and getting paid the best you can by solving problems, but the world will very much so continue and go on without you, which honestly I thought was great. That though does bring us to our combat section. Combat in this game is turn-based move and action systems, which is pretty par for the course, but there are some things that I want to note here. Every character will get to move, make a basic action, as well as any special actions based on the available valor points every single turn. Each special move can only be used once, as well as basic, and then you can move whatever your max movement is, but there are some things to know. If you attack a character in melee, or a character attacks you in melee, you'll be engaged in combat at that point, and to move you'll have to disengage, which will trigger an attack of opportunity from the enemy, so generally you want to avoid that. It's also a great way to lock down enemies from moving if you don't want them to. Your basic attack is dictated by what weapon that character has equipped. Each weapon type will typically have a few of these to pick from, some of which hit in an area, some of which hit a specific target, some do special things under certain circumstances, but do know that the basic attack is dictated by the weapon you have equipped. But then we have our special skills, our valor point skills. These are typically from your specialization or your class. They cost valor points. Valor points are a group-wide resource for your team. In the beginning, these will be pretty light. However, later in the game, they'll pretty much be maxed out all the time. You will get some valor points when you rest potentially, and some can be earned temporarily in combat if you meet certain circumstances, like having an enemy engaged in combat or killing an enemy, etc. Special actions use these valor points, but again, group-wide. You can use each of your special actions once per turn as well, so if you have more than one, you can use them. And then the other big thing to know here is the turn order. When it is your turn, you can use any character you have on that turn. The enemy will actually move in sort of a set order, if you will, and typically you'll take a turn and then the enemy will take a turn, but the turn is over when every character on the field has taken their turn, meaning that it is pretty easy to just vastly outnumber an enemy, at least in region locked mode, whereas adaptive mode will sort of kind of always scale up the amount of enemies in comparison to you, but sometimes you can just absolutely vastly outnumber the enemy and destroy them that way. So maximizing the action economy is a big part of combat in this game, and there are some fun ways to do that, and they have some fun options. For instance, I had an assassin character who picked up a special dagger that allowed it to consume poison charges on hit to do increased damage. Well, my assassin had a special ability where if he attacks an enemy from behind that is engaged in combat, he'll attack 3 times, applying 6 poison charges, and he had another class skill that spread this poison to any surrounding enemies. Then I can use that weapon's basic attack to deal roughly 150% increased damage on top of the increased damage from hitting a character in the back already, which was a great way to just annihilate enemies. To give another example, there is a Berserker class which has a few abilities they can pick up that allow them to deal 100% increased damage on their first turn. Combined with weapons that hit more than once with their basic ability, this will just delete enemies on turn 1, allowing you to quickly gain the advantage of having more units than the enemy does. And these are just some of the ways you can sort of reach the break point in combat for the difficulty you're on relatively quickly. Though again, levels are important. If you are facing an enemy that's even a little bit over leveled compared to you, you'll probably have a more difficult time than you would fighting someone even the same level as you. All things you need to keep in mind. Another important part of combat is the armor and injury systems based on the light, heavy, or medium armor that you have each individual character in. That gets chewed through first in most combat situations outside of a few abilities that deal direct health damage, which will protect you from some incoming blows, with more heavily armored characters usually taking a reduction to movement at the expense of being harder to kill. Armor has to be repaired after combat, which will cost you repair materials, and any damage to your health can potentially lead to a character getting an injury, which requires medicine to heal. Both of these can be bought from either a forge or an apothecary, respectively, and it is possible to craft your own medicine or potentially dismantle equipment you don't need for repair materials, etc. So it is important and it pays to be careful in combat and try to minimize damage to yourself, which will make your life a little bit easier. Beyond that though, I would say combat here is relatively straightforward. I think it would be much improved if they threw some elevation into the mix. All of your maps and everything that you'll see are decently varied. However, there is no elevation to any of them. It's all just flat ground. And the other thing I would note is that late game, when there's potentially 30 to 50 units on the field, combat gets very, very bogged down because there's not really any way to speed that up, which means combat goes from being relatively quick and snappy in the beginning of the game to getting very long-winded towards the end. That though is going to bring us to some technical issues with the game. Now really I don't have too much to report here. There are a variety of minor bugs that don't really affect anything, such as animations glitching out, and then sometimes the game will stutter when I first started playing. Like the first combat session for that play session, every time I took an attack the game would stutter a little bit, but beyond that I didn't have any issues. However, with this game having been released for a few days officially, looking into other people's experience, some people are reporting various issues with more pronounced stuttering, alongside more serious bugs where they just couldn't interact with characters anymore, that kind of thing. Again, I didn't have any of those problems, but I have seen reports of those, so that might be something to keep in mind or watch out for. Personally, it was real minor stuff though. That is going to bring us to our Steam Deck section, however, and the official rating here is playable, and for the most part I would agree. It's certainly not a bad experience on Steam Deck, but it lacks a few features that would make it more playable. First and foremost, it is lacking in controller support. And for the Steam Deck, that goes a really long way, which means you either have to get used to the controls or map them yourself. And because of this, when you go to save your game and it requires you to enter a name for the save, you'll have to use the Steam's keyboard, which may or may not work for you. However, beyond that though, the game will remember whatever your PC graphics settings are, so if you're playing on high on a PC, you're going to want to turn that down on the Steam Deck, as the high graphic settings will struggle there. However, if you turn it down to low or medium, you should be good to go, at least walking around the open world. And then when you get into actual combat, it feels pretty good. Most TRPGs play very well on the Steam Deck, and that is very much so the case here, with that tactical turn-based combat being a pretty positive experience on the Steam Deck in particular. So, to reiterate, very playable on the Steam Deck, but it's certainly not a perfect experience, and controller support would go a long way, which I would say is the biggest downside. That, though, brings us to our positives and negatives, and then we will wrap this thing up. So, on the positive side of things, the gameplay and progression systems are fantastic. It's a lot of little individual touches that come together to make a really fantastic overall experience. And while it's hard to label any of those specifically, even in this wrap-up section, the gameplay and the progression systems are wonderful to engage with. It feels like you're always going somewhere. It feels like you're always learning things, getting involved in various problems, and it's a really rewarding experience when you see it through. And then we have the world itself. The world is really the highlight of this game to me. Moving through it, doing all the various stuff you can do, it feels very well realized, to a point where it feels like the world will carry on without you. The world does not need you. You might be helpful, but the world will adjust and change and carry on. Merchants will keep traveling the roads, etc., which makes the world feel lived in, which is a wonderful touch. There are, however, some negatives I want to talk about, the biggest being that combat gets incredibly tedious towards the end, especially if you aren't building your troop the right way. While I didn't really talk about it too much in the rest of the review, there are a lot of units which feel like traps. For instance, you can capture and use wolves and things in combat, but they're not very good. They die very quickly. If you don't have a Beastmaster, they'll just run around and get themselves killed, which can be incredibly frustrating. And things like that can result in a lot of almost busy work where you'll have to get through a bunch of stuff before it feels like you can get back to playing the game, because there's so many systems that sometimes you're going to be micromanaging a lot of them, and that's something some people will love. But to me, it definitely felt a little tedious at times, let's say. And then lastly, on the negatives, there is the lack of a central narrative. And while for much of the world, I think that still works, actually, there does come a point when you're just kind of done with everything. There's nothing more to see, which means when you're ready to sort of put this down and move on, it's kind of underwhelming. There's no climax to it, really. You're just kind of done. And that's that, which feels a little underwhelming for a game that does a fantastic job of building the world out elsewhere. All of that brings me to my conclusion. Overall, Wartales is a fantastic experience that sees you guiding these mercenaries, learning their stories, which you'll likely remember pretty fondly, as you try to guide them through surviving this relatively brutal world. And while the game certainly has a few problems that could easily be ironed out over time, I might add, those are easily overlooked for all of the other things this game does really, really well. And that, combined with the relatively cheap price of the game, makes it an easy game for me to recommend to you. Right now, the game is on a launch sale for its release out of early access that sees it 25% off, which puts it at roughly $25 US, and then whatever the regional pricing is for you, with the full price being about $35. And for that price, I think you are getting a wonderful RPG with a deep world to immerse yourself in that you could easily spend hundreds of hours in. So again, very easy game to recommend, so it gets a buy from me. All of that said, I certainly hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. It means the world to me that people want to hear what I have to say about these games, and getting to do this for a living is a dream come true. So thank you, may you wander in wisdom, and have an amazing day.